The Americans, Chapter 13, Changes on the Western Frontier. Section 2, Settling on the Great Plains. When Esther Clark Hill was a girl on the Kansas prairie in the 1860s, her father often left the family to go on hunting or trading expeditions. His trips left Esther's mother, Elena Clark, alone on the farm. Esther remembered her mother holding on to the reins of a runaway mule team, her black hair tumbling out of its pins and over her shoulders, her face set and white, while one small girl clung with chattering teeth to the sides of the rocking wagon. The men in the settlement spoke admiringly about Lenny's nerve, and Esther thought the daily life presented a challenge even greater than driving a runaway team. A personal voice, Esther Clark Hill. I think as much courage as it took to hang on to the reins that day, it took more to live 24 hours at a time, month in and month out, on the lonely and lovely prairie, without giving up to the loneliness. As the railroads penetrated the frontier and the days of the free-ranging cowboy ended, hundreds of thousands of families migrated west, lured by vast tracts of cheap, fertile land. In their effort to establish a new life, they endured extreme hardships and loneliness. Part 1. Settlers moved westward to farm. It took over 250 years from the first settlement at Jamestown until 1870 to turn 400 million acres of forests and prairies into flourishing farms. Settling the second 400 million acres took only 30 years, from 1870 to 1900. Federal land policy and the completion of transcontinental railroad lines made this rapid settlement possible. Railroads opened the West. From 1850 to 1871, the federal government made huge land grants to the railroads. 170 million acres, worth $500 million, for laying track in the West. In one grant, both the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific received 10 square miles of public land for every mile of track laid in a state and 20 square miles for land for every mile of track laid in a territory. In the 1860s, two companies began a race to lay track. The Central Pacific moved eastward from Sacramento, and the Union Pacific moved westward from Omaha. Civil War veterans, Irish and Chinese immigrants, African Americans, and Mexican Americans did most of the grueling labor. In late 1868, workers for the Union Pacific cut their way through the solid rock of the mountains, laying up to 8 miles of track a day. Both companies had reached Utah by the spring of 1869. 15 years later, the country boasted 5 transcontinental railroads. The rails to the east and west coasts were forever linked. The railroad companies sold some of their land to farmers for $2 to $10 an acre. Some companies successfully sent agents to Europe to recruit buyers. By 1880, 44% of the settlers in Nebraska and more than 70% of those in Minnesota and Wisconsin were immigrants. Government supports the settlement. For another powerful attraction of the West was the land itself. In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act, offering 160 acres of land free to any citizen or intended citizen who was head of the household. From 1862 to 1900, up to 600,000 families took advantage of the government's offer. Several thousand settlers were exodusters, African Americans who moved from the post-Reconstruction South to Kansas. Despite the massive response by homesteaders or settlers on this free land, private speculators and railroad and state government agents sometimes used the law for their own gain. Cattlemen fenced open lands, while miners and woodcutters claimed national resources. Only about 10% of the land was actually settled by the families for whom it was intended. In addition, not all plots of land were of equal value. Although 160 acres could provide a decent living in fertile soil of Iowa or Minnesota, settlers on drier western lands required larger plots to make farming worthwhile. Eventually, the government strengthened the Homestead Act and passed more legislation to encourage settlers. In 1889, a major land giveaway in what was now Oklahoma attracted thousands of people. In less than a day, land-hungry settlers claimed 2 million acres in a massive land rush. Some took possession of the land before the government officially declared it open. Because these settlers claimed land sooner than they were supposed to, Oklahoma came to be known as the Sooner State. Closing of the frontier. The settlers gobbled up western land. As settlers gobbled up western land, Henry D. Washburn and fellow explorer Nathaniel P. Langford asked Congress to help protect the wilderness from settlement. In 1870, Washburn, who was surveying land in northwestern Wyoming, described the area's geysers and bubbling springs as objects new in experience, possessing unlimited grandeur and beauty. In 1872, the government created Yellowstone National Park. 7 years later, the Department of the Interior forced railroads to give up their claim to western land holdings that were equal in area to New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia combined. Even so, by 1880, individuals had bought more land than 19 million acres of government-owned land. 10 years later, the Census Bureau declared that the country no longer had a continuous frontier line. The frontier no longer existed. To many, the frontier was what had made America unique. In an 1893 essay entitled The Significance of the Frontier in American History, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner agreed. A personal voice, Frederick Jackson Turner. American social development has been continually beginning over again on the frontier. This perennial rebirth, this fluidity of American life, this expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnish the forces dominating American character. Today, many historians question Turner's view. They think he gave too much importance to the frontier in the nation's development in shaping a special American character. Part 2, Settlers Meet the Challenges of the Plains. The frontier settlers faced extreme hardships, droughts, floods, fires, blizzards, locust plagues, and occasional raids by outlaws and Native Americans. Yet the number of people living west of the Mississippi River grew from 1% of the nation's population in 1850 to almost 30% by the turn of the century. Dugouts and soddies. Since trees were scarce, most settlers built their homes from the land itself. Many pioneers dug their homes into the sides of ravines or small hills. A stovepipe jutting out from the ground was often the only clear sign of such a dugout home. Those who moved to the broad, flat plains often made freestanding houses by stacking blocks of prairie turf. Like a dugout, a sod home, or soddy, was warm in the winter and cool in the summer. Soddies were small, however, and offered little light or air. They were havens for snakes, insects, and other pests. Although they were fireproof, they leaked continuously when it rained. Women's work. Virtually alone on the flat, endless prairie, homesteaders had to be almost superhumanly self-sufficient. Women often worked beside the men in the fields, plowing the land and planting and harvesting the predominant crop, wheat. They sheared the sheep and carded wool to make clothes for their families. They hauled water from wells they had helped to dig, and made soap and candles from tallow. At harvest time, they canned fruits and vegetables. They were skilled in doctoring, from snake bites to crushed limbs. Women also sponsored schools and churches in an effort to build strong communities. Technical support for farmers. Establishing a homestead was challenging. Once accomplished, it was farming the prairie, year in and year out, that became an overwhelming task. In 1837, John Deere had invented a steel plow that could slice through heavy soil. In 1847, Cyrus McCormick began to mass produce a reaping machine, but a mass market for these devices didn't fully develop until the late 1800s, with the migration of farmers onto the plains. Other new and improved devices made farm work speedier, with spring-tooth harrow to prepare the soil, 1869, the grain drill to plant the seed, 1841, barbed wire to fence the land, 1874, and the corn binder in 1878. Then came a reaper that could cut and thresh wheat in one pass. By 1890, there were more than 900 manufacturers of farm equipment. In 1830, producing a bushel of grain took about 183 minutes. By 1900, with the use of these machines, it took only 10 minutes. These inventions made more grain available for a wider market. Agricultural education. The federal government supported farmers by financing agricultural education. The Morrill Act of 1862 and 1890 gave federal land to the states to help finance agricultural colleges, and the Hatch Act of 1887 established agricultural experiment stations to inform farmers of new developments. Agricultural researchers developed grains for arid soil and techniques for dry farming, which helped the land retain moisture. These innovations enabled the dry eastern plains to flourish and become the breadbasket of the nation. Farmers in debt. Elaborate machinery was expensive, and farmers often had to borrow money to buy it. When prices for wheat were higher, farmers could usually repay their loans. When wheat prices fell, however, farmers needed to raise more crops to make ends meet. This situation gave rise to a new type of farming in the late 1870s. Railroad companies and investors created bonanza farms, enormous single-crop spreads of 15,000 to 50,000 acres. The Cass Cheney Dalrymple Farm near Castleton, North Dakota, for example, covered 24 square miles. By 1900, the average farmer had nearly 150 acres under cultivation. Some farmers mortgaged their land to buy more property, and as farms grew bigger, so did farmers' debts. Between 1885 and 1890, much of the plains experienced drought, and the large-scale single-crop operations couldn't compete with smaller farms, which could be more flexible in the crops they grew. The bonanza farms slowly folded into bankruptcy. Farmers also felt pressure from the rising cost of shipping grain. Railroads charged Western farmers a higher fee than they did farmers in the East. Also, the railroads sometimes charged more for short hauls, for which there was no competing transportation, than for long hauls. The railroads claimed that they were merely doing business, but farmers resented being taken advantage of. No other system of taxation has borne as heavily on the people as those extortions and inequalities of railroad charges, wrote Henry Demarest Lloyd in an article in March 1881 edition of Atlantic Monthly. Many farmers found themselves growing as much grain as they could grow on as much land as they could acquire, which resulted in going further into debt. But they were not defeated by these conditions. Instead, these challenging conditions drew farmers together in a common cause.